You've been lied to, not carelessly, not by accident. You've been lied to deliberately, systematically, and profitably. And the lie is so deeply embedded in how we talk about money, housing, and the American dream that most people will go their entire lives never questioning it. The lie is this: if you work hard enough, save enough, and make smart enough financial decisions, you will eventually own a home. That's the deal society sold you. That's what your parents believed. That's what every mortgage broker, every open house, every smiling real estate agent whispered to you with a handshake and a glossy brochure. But what nobody realizes, what almost nobody is willing to say out loud, is that the game changed. Quietly, permanently, and without your permission. Right now, in this moment, there are homes in your city that will never be listed on Zillow. They will never appear on Realtor.com. You will never get the chance to make an offer on them because they were purchased before they were ever made available to people like you. Purchased in bulk, purchased by entities with names that sound like law firms or aerospace companies. Purchased by algorithms that decided your neighborhood was worth more than you could afford to pay. And here is what makes this deeply unsettling. The story of why you cannot afford a house is not a story about your salary. It is not primarily a story about interest rates or inflation or your spending habits. Those are symptoms. This is a story about a silent, coordinated, and entirely legal transformation of the residential real estate market. A transformation engineered by a small group of institutional investors whose business model depends, quite literally depends, on you renting forever. By the end of this video, you are going to see the housing market in a way you have never seen it before. You are going to understand the specific mechanism by which your monthly rent check is being converted into someone else's permanent generational wealth. You are going to see the data, real numbers, real companies, real strategies that most financial content creators either don't know about or don't want to talk about. And you're going to understand the one belief these institutions need you to hold. The one idea they spend billions of dollars reinforcing. Because if the average person ever stopped believing it, the entire model would collapse overnight. We need to start in 2008. Not because that's where the story ends, but because that's where the machinery was built. When the housing market collapsed, in 2008, millions of Americans lost their homes. It was devastating, personal, and for most people, completely bewildering. They had been told real estate was safe. They had been told home prices always go up. They had been sold mortgages by banks that smiled and nodded and never mentioned the word adjustable. And then everything unraveled. Families lost equity they had spent decades building, neighborhoods hollowed out, properties sat vacant and deteriorating, and the banks, the very institutions that had engineered the predatory loan structures that caused the collapse, found themselves holding millions of foreclosed properties they did not know what to do with. Here is where most people stop paying attention, because what happened next was not covered in your evening news. It was not explained in your economics class. It unfolded in boardrooms, in private equity meetings, in late-night conference calls between hedge fund managers and government regulators, who were desperate to stabilize a market that had just destroyed the savings of an entire generation. The Federal Reserve dropped interest rates to near zero, and a new class of investor, flush with cheap capital, armed with sophisticated data, analytics, and completely unencumbered by any emotional attachment to the concept of a neighborhood, realized something extraordinary. Distressed single-family homes were being sold at historic lows. And if you could acquire them at scale, renovate them minimally, and rent them out indefinitely, you could build a cash-flowing real estate empire, the likes of which had never existed. In the history of American housing, BlackStone moved first. Then came Invitation Homes, American Residential Properties, Waypoint Homes, Progress Residential, First Key Homes. The names are deliberately forgettable. The strategy was anything but. Between 2011 and 2017, institutional investors purchased an estimated 350,000 single-family homes across the United States. In certain zip codes in Phoenix, Atlanta, Charlotte, and Tampa, these firms acquired up to 25% of all available housing inventory within months, not years, months. Think carefully about what that number means. In some neighborhoods, 1 out of every 4 homes that went on the market was purchased not by a family, not by a first-time buyer saving for a down payment, but by a corporation executing a spreadsheet-driven acquisition strategy. And because they were buying with cash, no financing contingencies, no inspection delays, no emotional hesitation, they could close in days. Individual buyers couldn't compete. They weren't designed to compete. But this is where everything changes. Because what started as an opportunistic post-crisis strategy evolved into something far more permanent, something far more deliberate. These companies did not flip the homes and exit. They held them. They rented them. And as the market recovered, as home prices climbed, as interest rates eventually rose and made purchasing even more difficult for average buyers, the institutions did not sell. They doubled down. They raised rents. They expanded into new markets. And they brought their friends. By 2022, institutional investors owned somewhere between 574,000 and 1.16 million single-family rental homes in the United States, depending on how you define institutional. And that range itself tells you something important, because the data is deliberately difficult to track. These entities operate through shell companies, limited liability corporations, and holding structures that are specifically designed to obscure the scale of their ownership. When you try to find out who owns the house next door, the paper trail often leads through 5 or 6 legal entities before you arrive at a name anyone recognizes. This is not accidental. Opacity is a feature, not a flaw. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, okay, but isn't this just capitalism? Aren't investors allowed to buy property? And the answer technically is yes. But that framing misses the deeper structural problem. Because what we are talking about is not a few investors buying rental properties. We are talking about the systematic financialization of the asset class that ordinary Americans have used for decades as their primary vehicle for wealth building. We are talking about the conversion of homes, shelter, stability, community, into financial instruments optimized for shareholder returns. And when that conversion happens at scale, the consequences are not abstract. They are measurable, they are severe, and they fall almost entirely on the people who can least afford them. Here is the mechanism. Pay close attention to this part. When institutional investors purchase large quantities of homes in a specific market, they reduce the supply available to individual buyers. Basic economics. Less supply, same demand, higher prices. But the effect doesn't stop there, because these institutions are not passive landlords. They are data-driven operators who use algorithmic pricing tools, some of which are explicitly designed to coordinate rent increases across competing landlords in the same market. In 2022, a class action lawsuit was filed, alleging that a software company called RealPage was being used by major landlords, including several institutional players, to share pricing data and synchronize rent increases in ways that would be illegal if done through direct communication between competitors. The Department of Justice opened an investigation. Several states launched their own probes. The company denied wrongdoing, but the lawsuit revealed something the rental market had long suspected. The rent increases you experienced in 2021 and 2022 were not random. They were not simply the result of inflation or supply chain disruptions. They were, at least in part, the output of a coordinated system designed to extract maximum rent from the largest possible number of tenants simultaneously. And this is where the psychological dimension enters the story. Because institutional investors are not just winning through capital and scale. They are winning through narrative. The story they need you to believe, the story they fund think tanks, lobby politicians, and place in mainstream financial media to reinforce, is that the housing affordability crisis is entirely a supply, Problem. Build more homes, the argument goes, and prices will fall. The institutions will step aside. The market will correct itself. There is partial truth buried in this argument. Supply does matter. Zoning reform is real and necessary. But notice what the supply-only narrative conveniently omits. It omits demand distortion. It omits algorithmic rent coordination. It omits the fact that institutional buyers are themselves a source of artificial demand. Demand that competes directly with the families and first-time buyers the market is supposedly serving. It omits the reality that in markets where institutional ownership is highest, rents have risen fastest, not because of insufficient supply, but because of concentrated ownership power. The supply narrative is not wrong. It is incomplete, and its incompleteness serves a very specific set of interests. Here is something you were almost certainly never taught in school. In the United States, homeownership has historically been the single most powerful wealth-building mechanism available to the middle class. Not the stock market, not savings accounts, not employer pension plans. Homes. The appreciation of residential real estate has accounted for a substantial portion of net worth for the majority of American households for the last century. And unlike most other assets, a home provides both a financial return and a fundamental human need, shelter, simultaneously. When you own your home, rising property values build your net worth automatically. You are essentially forced to save through your mortgage payments. You gain stability, the ability to put down roots, to make long-term decisions, to raise children in consistent environments. The social science literature on this is extensive. Homeowners have better health outcomes, higher civic participation rates, stronger community ties. The benefits are not just financial, they are deeply human. Now remove that asset class from the reach of an entire generation. That is what is happening. The homeownership rate for adults under 35 has fallen to levels not seen since the Great Depression. The average age of a first-time homebuyer in the United States is now 36. In 1981, it was 29. That 7-year gap represents 7 fewer years of equity accumulation, 7 fewer years of appreciation, 7 fewer years of building the asset that your parents and grandparents used to fund their retirements, help their children, and weather financial storms. But here is the detail that almost nobody talks about. The decline in young homeownership is not evenly distributed. It follows income, race, and geography in patterns that are entirely predictable once you understand the institutional ownership map. The zip codes where institutional investors have the highest ownership concentration are, with very few exceptions, the same zip codes where Black and Hispanic homeownership has declined most sharply. This is not coincidence. These were the neighborhoods where the 2008 crisis hit hardest, where foreclosure rates were highest, where distressed properties were cheapest, and where institutional buyers moved fastest and most aggressively. What we are watching in real time is the reversal of decades of incremental wealth-building gains for communities that were already far behind. And it is happening through entirely legal market mechanisms that most people do not understand and have never been asked to think critically about. Let's talk about the numbers that the institutions themselves will never volunteer. Invitation. Homes, the largest single-family rental company in the United States, owns approximately 80,000 homes as of recent reporting. It is publicly traded. It has a market capitalization in the tens of billions of dollars. In its annual filings, it describes its homes as assets. It describes its tenants as customers. It calculates something called net operating income. Essentially, the gap between what it collects in rent and what it spends on operations and maintenance. And it optimizes obsessively for the growth of that number. What this means in practice is that every dollar you pay in rent above their cost basis is profit flowing to institutional shareholders. And because they own at scale, because they have pricing power, because their algorithmic tools tell them exactly what the market will bear before tenants choose to leave, they can extract that profit with surgical precision. They know the point at which raising your rent will cause you to move. And they price just below it, every month, year after year. Meanwhile, a homeowner in the same neighborhood watching her property value rise is accumulating equity. Her monthly mortgage payment stays fixed. Her asset appreciates. Over 30 years, the gap between what she pays and what her home is worth grows consistently in her favor. The renter in the institutionally owned home across the street experiences the exact opposite dynamic. His monthly payment rises. His wealth position relative to the market deteriorates. He builds nothing. This is not a metaphor. This is arithmetic. And it is arithmetic that compounds over decades. Now we arrive at the part of the story that is most important and most uncomfortable. Because the question you should be asking at this point is not just, why is this happening? The question is, why is this being allowed to happen? Why have regulators not intervened? Why have legislators not acted? Why, as institutional ownership has grown and rents have accelerated and young home ownership has collapsed, has the policy response been so tepid, so slow, so structurally inadequate? The answer is a word you know, but may not have applied in this context. Incentives. The institutions that own your neighborhood also own significant influence over the political process. BlackStone alone spends millions annually on federal lobbying. The National Rental Home Council, a trade group representing institutional single-family landlords, has registered lobbyists in dozens of states. They fund academic research through think tanks that produce policy-friendly findings. They donate to political campaigns on both sides of the aisle. Not because they are evil, but because influencing the regulatory environment is simply cheaper than complying with regulations that would reduce their returns. And it works. When legislation to restrict institutional ownership of single-family homes has been introduced at the state level, in California, in North Carolina, in several other states, it has consistently failed to advance. When researchers have proposed data transparency requirements that would make institutional ownership patterns publicly trackable, those proposals have met fierce industry opposition. The black box of who owns your neighborhood is not a technical limitation. It is a business requirement. There is also something more subtle happening, something psychological and cultural that the institutions actively benefit from, even if they do not explicitly engineer it. The belief that housing prices only go up, the same belief that inflated the bubble that collapsed in 2008, is actually deeply useful to institutional real estate investors. When the general public believes that home prices will always appreciate, they accept that being priced out is temporary. They assume that if they just wait long enough, work hard enough, save aggressively enough, the market will eventually become accessible again. They do not question the system. They blame themselves. They adjust their expectations downward. Smaller homes, different neighborhoods, longer timelines. And while they adjust and wait and hope, the institutions continue. Accumulating, this is the patience trap, and it is devastatingly effective. Because here is the truth that the institutions understand, and that most individuals do not fully internalize until it is too late. In a market where institutional ownership is growing and supply is constrained, time does not work in your favor. Every year you wait, the entry price rises. Every year you rent, you pay down someone else's mortgage instead of your own. Every year, the gap between your savings and the down payment required widens. Patience in this particular market dynamic is not a strategy. It is a slow surrender. So what does this mean for you? Not in an abstract policy sense. In a practical, this is your actual life sense. It means the single most dangerous assumption you can make right now is that your housing situation will naturally improve over time without deliberate, aggressive, and unconventional action. The default outcome, continuing to rent, continuing to watch prices, waiting for the right moment, is not neutral. It is a wealth-destroying position that becomes harder to exit with every passing year. It means understanding that geography is more important than most people realize. Institutional ownership is not uniform. There are still markets, smaller cities, emerging metros, overlooked regions, where individual buyers can compete, where prices have not yet been institutionally inflated, where the calculus of owning versus renting still strongly favors ownership. Finding those markets and being willing to move to them is not a compromise. In the current environment, it is one of the most financially significant decisions you can make. It means paying attention to policy developments with a specificity most people never bother with. Several states and municipalities are beginning to move on institutional ownership restrictions. Some are considering property transfer taxes targeted specifically at bulk residential purchases. Others are experimenting with right of first refusal policies that give existing tenants the ability to purchase their homes when landlords decide to sell. These policies are imperfect and contested, but they represent the first serious legislative acknowledgement that the housing market has a structural problem that the market itself will not solve. And it means, perhaps most fundamentally, rejecting the narrative that your inability to afford a home is primarily a reflection of your personal financial decisions. That narrative is comfortable for institutions. It shifts responsibility from a broken system to individual behavior. It keeps you focused on cutting expenses and increasing income, while the structural forces reshaping the market operate far above the level at which personal finance advice can help. This does not mean personal finance is irrelevant. It means it is insufficient as a complete explanation and as a complete solution. Here is where we come back to where we started. You were told a story. The story of the meritocratic housing market. Work hard, save diligently, and the door to home ownership will open. And for a long time, not forever, but for a long time, that story had enough truth in it to be believable. Your parents believed it because for them, in their moment, it was largely accurate. The market they navigated was imperfect, but it was fundamentally accessible to people willing to work for it. That market no longer exists in the same form, and the institutions that have replaced it are not going to voluntarily restore it. They have no incentive to. Every year the rental market remains dominant. Every year home ownership remains out of reach for the next wave of middle-class buyers is another year of compounding returns for their investors and widening wealth gaps. For everyone else, the question is not whether the system is broken. The data makes that undeniable. The question is whether enough people understand how it broke and who broke it, and what specifically they gain from your continued confusion about why you cannot seem to get ahead. Because institutions do not fear a population that is struggling. They fear a population that understands exactly why it is struggling. You've now seen the mechanism. You've seen the companies, the strategies, the data, the incentives, the political architecture that sustains it all. What you do with that understanding, how you vote, how you move, how you allocate your financial energy, how you talk about this to the people around you, that is where the story either continues or begins to change. The system was not built overnight. It will not be dismantled overnight. But awareness is the prerequisite for everything that comes next. And you are now, whatever else happens, less easy to lie to than you were 20 minutes ago. If this gave you a new lens on the world you're navigating, consider subscribing to FinTrove. Because there is an entire layer of the financial system that most content never touches, and we are just getting started.